Hey everybody, welcome back. This is the fourth episode of Game Master Craft, the new show here on the RPG Daily. I'm your host, Richard Quiner, and as always, today we have another really good guest, a really interesting, very insightful member of the community who's kind of built a nice community around his own content and what he does in his message, which we're going to get into in a little bit. We're going to be talking with Jason Russell, so stick around. All right, Jason, welcome to the stream. This has been, I've been mentioning doing an interview with you forever, and it only took a global pandemic for me to actually nail down a day and get you to do this.
Yeah, it was.
Mostly my fault.
Yeah, it's just as easy as a worldwide pandemic.
Yeah, just a little bit of a push was all it took.
Yeah.
Welcome to the stream. Welcome to the show. I appreciate you taking the time on this Thursday afternoon to come sit down with me. Before we get started, though, let the viewers know what is it that you do. How long? Let's start with that. Just what is it that you do in the world?
So, hi, I'm Jason from CriticalDice, and I run a Instagram account called CriticalDice, where I do game hooks and run a website, thecriticaldice.com, where I sell dice and other tools to for D&D. And what I do, basically, if you boil it down, is I provide resources to help you have more fun at your table.
And you've been doing that for quite a while.
Yeah, about 2.5 years now. It's sneaking up on me. Yeah.
I just had to look up while you were mentioning that you are on GameHook 487.
487, yeah, almost to 500 now.
That is an insane amount of game hooks.
It is. I feel the same way.
That's no one person would be able to use that many in one game. I think it would, unless you're that type who have like a 40-year-long game and you use all these hooks. It's possible, I guess. It's possible, but it's a big accomplishment getting that many stories. And I know you do source from your community a bit.
Yeah, about half of them come from the community and the other half come from me, yeah.
Which that's awesome. Getting the community involved is something, that's kind of a big deal. And that's something you don't see often. A lot of times Game Master tends to be in their own little bubble and they don't go outside of that. They go to like the published modules and then their own brain, and that's it. But you got people throwing stuff at you.
Yeah, and that's the thing is, like, I'm a big believer in collaboration and the idea that we're better together. And I think that's why both you and I are part of the D&D Coalition, a group of like-minded content creators for the D&D space. And all of us are on Instagram and Twitter and things. And we work together to help make really great things. And so it was a natural kind of thing for me to open up the game hooks after I did the first 100 to people and say, hey, why don't you guys make some? I'm sure you have great ideas, because, you know, no matter how brilliant you are, to how inspired you are, creative you are, you're always going to be better if you work with somebody else and you bounce those ideas off somebody else. And what that's caused is a D&D community on Instagram and even on my page, on my account, that's been really surprising, because there's this really great community, and Instagram isn't meant for community, and so it's kind of surprising that it's happened anyway, and it's been really phenomenal, actually.
Yeah, it's really amazing to see, and I've been enjoying taking some of your hooks here and there. I try to find ways to work them into my stories. Yeah, you know, little side quests and things. It's not as easy as that seems, though. You know, getting people to go after side quests is not an easy task. But we'll get into that a little more later, because I have some questions about how you run your games, because you have a very a specific niche that I want to talk about later. But before we get into that, I want to know how you got into the game. Like, how long ago was that? When did you start running your own games? And yeah, we'll just start with there. That's easy.
Yeah. So I first played Dungeons and Dragons in 1989 when I was in middle school. Some friends were in the gym before school, and they had, I think, the red box, and it looked really neat. I was interested. I saw the dice. I heard them talking and running characters and things. And I was like, that's really neat, because I grew up like watching the old like Rankin Bass, like, Hobbit cartoons and
Oh
that kind
yeah.
of stuff. And I love just all the fantasy stuff and love the Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. And I'm like, that's really up my alley. And so I started messing around playing with those guys into high school on and off. And we were playing Calvin ball for the most part, not a lot of focus on the rules.
Nice reference. Nice
Uh,
reference.
yeah. And, like a lot of people, I would just make characters to make characters. I would just pour over the monster manual, which was really the most interesting thing to read when you're just by yourself. And then in college, I ended up being a roommate with a guy who had been a DM for his friend group all through high school. And so he was a really experienced dungeon master. And so me and another guy and a couple of others would play a lot, like a couple of times a week. Probably didn't help my grades any, but it was great having like, yeah, I had like a DM on tap. It was really great. He couldn't go
Nice.
anywhere,
Right.
and we were like, hey, let's play D&D. He's like, okay. And he would just grab a book off the shelf and just start going. And it was really awesome to see him bring that experience and expertise to bear for us. And he just took us on a whirlwind tour of all the kind of classics of D&D, and beholders and genies and giants and vampires and Strahd and all the crazy stuff. And then I moved around a bunch and lived overseas and did a bunch of different things for about 10 years. And I just kind of, as it goes, your life moves on, and you move on. And some of the things you used to love to do, you just can't do them anymore. And for good reasons. And then it was back in like end of '08, beginning of '09, when Acquisitions Incorporated started,
Mm.
the very first ones when they were rolling out fourth edition, which is kind of wild.
Yeah.
I started listening to those podcasts, and just like my love for the game got reignited. I was like, oh man, I miss this. And so I would kind of live vicariously through those pack streams and the podcasts and things. And then it was about 3 years ago that I was like, well, I've been a serial entrepreneur all my life, always starting little businesses and side gigs and things here and there. And I started to think, okay, well, I'd like to kind of like sell some things online. How can I do that? Did a bunch of research, and actually had dice made for me from a manufacturer that I sold on Amazon. I'm like, oh, this is great. And I just started teaching my kids how to play D&D. I had run a game for the first time first time in a long time, for a friend who had spent their Christmas money on D&D on the starter set. And they started doing that, and kind of really, I was like, okay, well, my kids are into it, and I'll start running games for them and stuff. And then I was like, okay, well, I'm selling these dice on Amazon, and I started making some custom ones for this little endeavor. And I was like, well, I should start social media to help promote it. And so I started my Instagram account on November 10th of 2017, and started putting up content. And I was like, well, I don't want to just spam people with buy my dice, buy my dice, buy my dice. I never want to do that. I want to provide value for people. And so I had started posting these game hooks on Facebook before, and so I started just posting the game hooks, and people really, really liked them, and watched the account like kind of explosively grow and get bigger. And that's kind of the short version of how all of that started, and how I started, playing D&D and getting back into it.
Nice. That sounds like kind of a roller coaster of a life, where you were in it for a while, then you dropped out, then you came back in, and then you made it even a bigger part of your life in recent years, and found a business around it. That's a lot of work,
Yeah, it has
and
been a lot of work.
I imagine that doesn't leave a whole lot of time for actual gaming.
Yeah, that's one of the sad truths of it all, is that I do get to game, but not as much as I'd like to,
Yeah.
because it's like, well, I can either game or I can be a part of the community in this way. And so I still run games for my kids, and even friends are there from theirs from school. I'll play on some live streams here and there with Fabled 42 and their
Hmm.
Twitch stream. And then I have a somewhat regular game here in town that I run for some folks. So
Okay.
yeah, so I'm not
So you
getting to
get your
play every
fix.
week, but yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Mentioning your kids, you also have a podcast that was running for a while. I haven't looked on my podcast app to see if you
Yeah.
uploaded recently, but it was D&D Junior. Is that
Yeah.
correct?
So D&D Junior was basically, I was like, hey, there's not a lot of like content out there for kids. Like, my kids know about Critical Role. They know about
Mm-hmm.
Acquisitions Incorporated, but a lot of the content's very, mature. And, I don't like to expose them to a lot of stuff that's like, just using, curse words and adult
Yeah.
themes and stuff. Cause I'm their father, and that's my purview. And so I was like, well, what if we did like a stream a stream of podcast where we just recorded our sessions and I'd edit it and put up the adventures. And we kind of started with Ghost of Salt Marsh when that came
Mm-hmm.
out. And then life just got too busy and I kind of had to stop. And so what's on there is what's on there for now.
Okay.
But I did start actually a new podcast with a friend of mine called The Compendium. And what's great about that for me is that my partner, Casey, my podcast partner, she does all the editing. I just have
Oh,
to show up
nice.
and talk. So that's going really well.
Yeah.
So if people want to find that, they can find it on Instagram and Twitter at the Compend
Ah, clever.
yes, and find it on iTunes and Podbean and Google and all that kind of stuff. And it basically is a podcast where we break down into these little mini 5 to 10 minute episodes of like rules of the game. And like for someone who's starting out brand new and they're like, I don't know what AC means. What is a proficiency bonus?
Mm-hmm.
I have to choose a race. That doesn't seem right. That's weird. Like, what do I do? Like, just starting clean, we're going to break down in really layman's terms, really simply, like, here's how all of that works. And so we'll record one big episode, like all about character, race, and class.
Mm-hmm.
And then we'll kind of put out little like segments of like, here's all about races, here's all about classes, here's all about skills and and your ability scores. And so that people can listen to the whole thing. Or if they're going back and they're like, oh, wait, how did they describe proficiency bonus again? You can go back and find the 5 minute excerpt. That's one little mini-sode
Mm-hmm.
of like, how do skills work? How do
Yeah.
proficiency bonuses work? And so that's ongoing right now. I actually recorded another episode of that earlier today.
Nice.
So I would encourage people to check that out. And because there's always people who are like, hey, when I'm getting started D&D, how do I start? Like, where do I
Yeah.
go? Is there easy like explainers someplace? And we're just like, just go right there, you're good.
Yeah,
So
that is a big hurdle, and I know for me when I get started, it was like that. It was like, where's the hurdle? Which is also why I got into making content. I wanted to answer my own questions in a way that I understood, which creates that same sort of thing. It just helps. It helps you. It helps other people. It just balloons out that way. I wanted to go back to running games with your kids
yeah,
because running games for children is a lot different than running games for adults.
it is.
And I wanted to get your input on that because a lot of people you get in the age where it's like, okay, you get older, you start thinking about kids and stuff like that. It's going to happen eventually. I'm looking at it being like, one day I'm going to have to run D&D for my children. What are some tips that I need to know that will help me run that more efficiently?
Yeah. So when you're running for D&D for kids, honestly, the way you start is by telling them bedtime stories and reading books to them. My wife and I have always loved reading to our kids, gave them a love of learning, a love of reading very, very early on. And our kids always have either an audiobook going or a book in their hands. And sometimes it's really hard to get them to stop because
Yeah.
it's time for bed. But the way that I started with my kids is I was going to go run that game for my friends. And he has some older kids
Mm-hmm.
than mine. And I was like, well, I don't know if you guys are ready for this yet or not. And so what I did is I started by and they were probably 8 and 10,
Mm-hmm.
maybe 7, 9, something like that. And I started just talking them through a story. And that classic cover where there's that big statue of Moloch with the burning cauldron in his hands, and like there's the ruby eyes, and there's a
Yeah.
guy like trying to pry the thing out. I just said it there just from memory, and was like, okay, I'm describing stuff. Hey, what do you do?
Mm-hmm.
And for when like combat kind of popped up, I just had them roll a d20 and did like a 50-50 split kind of thing.
Okay.
And I talked them through about a half an hour of like this really stripped down, super easy game, getting them used to the idea of just imagining a world in their head,
Mm-hmm.
responding to this kind of collaborative storytelling style, and we finished, and they're like, all right, and we're done. And they're like, what happens next? I'm like, okay, you're
And then
ready.
you've created monsters.
Yeah, exactly. And so like, all right, you're ready. You can come play with us. And so, but now as we've gone on, what's interesting is that kids, and when we say kids, like that's a big range. Like I know
Yeah.
some people who have started their kids at age 5 playing, and others who are like high school students. And just kind of know what your audience is. That's a good tip for any dungeon
Hmm.
master. Know your audience and know what they can handle and what they're interested in and those kinds of things. And so for my kids who have been during this experience, late elementary, early junior high, middle school kind of ages, is I'm using it to help them understand um, social interactions, how to work together, how to have common goals, how to even negotiate amongst each other at the table. And
Hmm.
so it's been a really great resource in even parenting, because with my son, I can, tell him the shopkeeper looks dubious, and then I'll make a dubious face. And then he was great for him is that because he has ADD, ADHD, and
Hmm.
sometimes he doesn't always catch the facial clues of people because he's so busy doing his thing, and he can start to match, oh, my face versus what I told you this means, and those kinds of things. But they're also working together to solve problems together, making moral choices, and those kinds of things.
Hmm.
So, what I would say, the tip number one, after you kind of gauge their ability to talk through a story with you, is just know your audience, know your kids, what can they handle, what do they like to do, and all those kinds of things, and then tailor it to that. And be willing to step in a little harder, perhaps, than what you might be used to mitigate conflict. Just to
Hmm.
step in and say, okay, well, wait a second. So she wants to do this, and you want to do this. Is there a way for you both to do it? Could you do one first and then the other? And those kinds of things. And I know that you had talked to Logan previously
Yeah.
on this show, and he talked about how he killed a character of one of his students,
Yeah.
and he was like rolling harder on his kids, his students, and it's like, whoa, that's different. It's for
That's
me,
very different.
it is. So I have a little bit of an opposite kind of idea where I'm like, no, I'm not. I'm going to try really hard not to kill them. It doesn't mean that I'll ever put them in peril or
Hmm.
make them, roll a death save or get really low in hit points, because I want them to feel that pressure. I want them to feel that their choices have consequences. But that's not the only way to show consequences. It
Yeah.
just seems like it's one of the most common ones. And so just it's not kid gloves. It's just a
Hmm.
game that is for kids. There's
Right.
a difference. One is just being too easy. The other one is knowing how to challenge your players, regardless of their age,
Hmm.
so that it's going to be a satisfying story for everyone involved. And for kids, you just have to do it a little bit differently to know, are they going to have an emotional breakdown if their pet or familiar dies?
Hmm.
Versus they don't really care if they lose their cool magic item. They're like, oh, okay, so I see where the kind of the pain points are there, and so I'll try to navigate ways that build suspension but also don't demoralize them. And so yeah, I think that'd be kind of my tips for DMing in
Hmm.
general, but also like for kids specifically. And also know that they probably have shorter attention spans than most people, and so keeping games
Hmm.
down to an hour or two might be the way to go.
Yeah.
It's not until later where they can kind of handle more stuff and longer sessions, because you can kind of see their resistance to focus start to build, and you're like, okay,
Hmm.
it's time to call it here, and you're acting a little irrationally. So yeah.
Hmm. Going back to that idea you mentioned about knowing when to push, how far you can push your players, how far you can challenge them, uh, that's an interesting concept, because that's another thing that DMs run into all the time, and just in any game is, how much of a challenge you actually give your players versus how easy do you want to be on them. Do you have any tips for just any DM who wants to find a nice balance, but maybe has a hard time seeing what works for players? Do you have any like tricks where you say, "Oh, this is the challenge," and then if it's too easy, maybe I go a little harder? Do you have any tips for that?
Yeah, actually, a lot of it is just about good communication. I'm pulling up something here.
Hmm.
The it's really about good communication and actually just asking your players what they want. So when I started my campaign here locally, one of the first things I did was ask them, like, what's your play style? Do you really like the role playing aspect of it and the interpersonal stuff, or do you really just love combat? And like, a game of D&D isn't a game of D&D unless there's combat to you, or do you love what makes you feel accomplished in a game? And I also had all of them answer 3 questions, and this is called what I call the 3 questions. And I got this from Jerry Holkins from Penny Arcade, who runs the
Okay.
Acquisitions Incorporated C Team thing.
Mm-hmm.
And the 3 questions are: what is your secret purpose for joining the party? Who have you wronged? And what would you kill to know?
Ah, those are good ones.
Yeah, they've been really useful. And so I gave them those questions and then asked for backstories from all of them. And what's great is I got so much great backstory from all my players, and probably more than I would have normally, I think, because they're looking for ways to answer those questions,
Mm-hmm.
which made them think and flesh out that stuff even more than they normally would. I had
Yeah.
one player that really surprised me. He wrote his backstory in first person.
Oh.
I did this and then this happened to me, as opposed to talking in the third person, which is really shows a lot of investment, which I really
Mm-hmm.
love. Um, and then I am trying to then also find ways of weaving the backstories that they gave me. They gave me all of this narrative fodder for me to use to keep them interested and rewarded, and find ways for them to win or have those highlighted moments. And I think that's what really helps keep players engaged and feeling satisfied with the story, is you give them those moments to shine.
Mm-hmm.
If you've got a cleric who can turn undead, man, give them some undead to turn. Let them feel like they're a hero. If you have a character who failed to save their whole village in their backstory, give them a village to save, and let them work through some of that stuff. But also too, I periodically check in with the group, both at the end of sessions, every few sessions, or at the end of
Mm-hmm.
like a big kind of arc as we pause to get into something else. It's like, is there anything that you're not getting from the game?
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything that you feel like is missing, or that you're just not getting what you want out of this? And we can talk publicly, but also too, I'll also reach out to them privately through text or through GroupMe or something, and just be like, hey, how's this going? How did you feel about that scene where X, Y, or Z happened?
Mm-hmm.
Those kinds of things. And then as a overarching idea too, because there's always the social aspect of things, and there's the advent of the X card, and where people can kind of just straight up say, hey, I'm not comfortable with this scenario. And I
Yeah.
think and generally speaking, that's a good idea. But for me, because I spend a large portion of my time um, running games for kids and things, I just don't put anything really dark or super adult, as
Mm-hmm.
it were, into my games. It doesn't mean that they're not, mature. It doesn't mean that they're not, built for adults. I just don't go into some of those darker places. And the fact that I just am not a fan of horror.
Mm-hmm.
I can't watch scary movies. My imagination just won't let me. It wrecks me for days. I read like one scary book a year, kind
Right.
of thing.
And then you
And
have to wait another year so you can sleep again, and then.
yeah, basically, yeah, read it all. It's like Halloween. I'm reading a book on Jack the Ripper, and all the lights are on in the house. Like, I even got the fridge doors open, so there's light there. And so I just don't go to a lot of like dark places,
Mm-hmm.
emotionally and socially in my games. And so I've had, I think, no negative feedback of like, oh, hey, that was too much for
Mm-hmm.
me. But even beyond that, like, challenging your players is just like, know what their secret goals are and help them develop secret goals and motivations, and give those things to them, or at least dangle them in front of them.
Mm-hmm.
I think of a good example is that one of my players is a revenant, and it's publicly known now among the group, so I can say it. They didn't know for a long time, but he basically said that he's a paladin. His monastery was completely destroyed. Kellenvor brings him back to life to kind of get vengeance, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in the book, it's like you always know where the people are who did this to you, the people who are responsible. And I changed it up a little bit and made it a little bit more like Highlander. Whenever
Okay.
two immortals get close to each other, they have that like
Yeah, they
wave of
can.
nausea, and they're like,
Yeah, and then they have to fight.
then they have to
Then
fight.
they
And
have to
so
fight. That's the
yeah,
important thing.
right. That's the important part. There can be only one. And and so I made it more like that. And in the very first session, like he gets that ping, that wave of nausea, followed by crystal perfect clear clarity. And I look at him and go, he's involved. And he's like, what? And like is about to wreck the guy, and then I call time on the game, like, and that's where we'll end tonight,
Oh.
and so he's just like champing at the bit to get back to the game, and everyone else is
Yeah.
like, wait, involved in what? And I'm like, you guys didn't hear that, So there's a lot of ways to pair knowing what they can handle
Mm-hmm.
with what they need and what they've told straight up told you what they want, and you
Mm-hmm.
can give that to them. It doesn't mean you're catering to your players or you're being a pushover. It's just like, if you go to the store and you pick up a mystery novel because you're in the mood for mystery and it's a romance novel, it may be the best romance novel in the world, but you came there for mystery.
Yeah.
So you're going to be disappointed. And so know what your players are expecting coming in, and
Mm-hmm.
then give them that and more.
Wow. That is really good advice. That it's good to hear that over and over again. As many times as people say, communicate with your players, get get that information from them over and over again. It's always good to hear that again. We do have two questions in the audience that I wanted to get early because they're topical. First up was one of them was asking if you could list those three questions again.
Yeah, absolutely. So number one is, what is your secret purpose for joining the party? Right? Because not everyone just meets in a tavern. They're out
Mm-hmm.
adventuring for some reason, and decided that, hey, me joining this group is going to help me achieve that goal. So what's your secret purpose for joining the party?
Uh huh.
The second one is, who have you wronged?
Who have
Who
you
have you
wronged?
wronged?
All right.
Right. So who might be out there looking for you? Maybe you abandoned your family because you wanted to go out and discover more about magic, and so your family's who you wronged because you ran away from home. It doesn't
Yeah.
have to be a big bad evil guy going for you. And then the third one is, what would you kill to know? Like, what is your ultimate goal beyond anything else that you would absolutely kill people for to know this one thing?
Nice. Yeah. So there's your questions. The other question that was asked, though, which I think is interesting, it is what game hooks work better for children versus adults? Since you've played with both, I feel like you have a good grasp on what hooks are good for kids, what are better for adults, etc.
Yeah, so I would say this is that hooks that are not complicated, hooks that seem pretty straightforward.
Mm-hmm.
And so ones that maybe have a lot of social interaction and intrigue and political maneuvering, kids may not get that. They're not
Mm-hmm.
necessarily at that developmental level to understand why someone might not report a murder because of how it affects their family dynamic or something, right? They don't, that's too sophisticated. Perhaps making something that has a very easy line from A to B.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, but the way I structure my game hooks is I set up the situation and then I give the twist. It's
Yeah.
really as simple as that. And so maybe think about setting up a situation that's pretty clear, like one of the early game hooks is there was a robbery from the king's treasury. No one went in or out, right? Classic locked room
Mm-hmm.
scenario. And so they know exactly what they need to do. Well, we need to get into that treasury and
Yep.
figure out how someone clearly got in or out. And so they know what they need to do. They have good motivation for it. You have a location. You have some NPCs already ready to go because you're going to have, the person who was guarding the treasury. Were they part of it? You have to have the king who might, or a lackey for the king who might elicit the help of the players.
Mm-hmm.
And so those things that seem really straightforward, the goal is obvious and perhaps isn't above the developmental level of the child or the student. is probably what's worked best for me.
Nice. That is very straightforward answers on that. I want to continue on this kid thing because I have another question I just thought of. Um, what is the favorite moment you've had while playing with your children, or any
Um,
children in general?
yeah, no, I'll give you two. My daughter, who's sitting on the floor looking at me, drawing, she has her kind of most played character is a sorcerer, dragonborn sorcerer, and she has this knack for picking spells that are going to thwart my plans, and she has no idea what's coming up next. So she finally gets to the level where she can pick third level spells. And the obvious choice for your third level spell for a sorcerer or wizard is Fireball. Like, I
Yeah,
mean, no question,
you
just
got
go
to
for
have
it.
that.
Yeah, maybe Lightning Bolt if you want to be a little fancy, right?
Yeah.
So she picks water breathing, and which is a fine choice. But I'm like, huh, okay, yeah. I mean, that makes sense. Like,
Okay.
you're not really, all about the aggro. But the next session I have is a ship voyage and an island and an underwater, partially sunken temple on the island. And I'm just like, well, dang it, And so, but it was beautiful because it keeps me on my toes.
Yeah.
And like I said before, she gets a moment to shine where she's like, "Oh, I can fix this with magic." Ding,
Hmm.
you know. The other story I can think of is I was playing with a bunch of 13-year-old guys um, from a class that I teach, and one of the guys had never played D&D before at all, and is one of those kids that gets pretty distracted pretty easily
Hmm.
in that kind of ADD way, where it's just like they have the 1,000-yard stare, and they're somewhere else thinking about the mechanics of Zelda and how he keeps all that stuff in this backpack.
It's very
And I'm trying to,
specific.
yeah, well, these are the thoughts we think, and
Hmm.
he and I could tell I wanted to pull him in a little bit more, and so I'm starting to ask him more questions even when it's not his turn, and he's playing something pretty straightforward, like a fighter or a barbarian or something. And he said, "All right, it's your turn. What do you want to do?" He's like, "Well, how close are these two guys?" I was like, "Well, they're right next to each other." And he's like, "All right, well, I'm gonna swing my sword and hit this guy." And he hits, and then he says, "Well, is there any way that I can like make my sword keep going and hit the other guy?" Right? And I'm like, "Great! Like you're thinking about the problem. You're engaged. This is awesome." And he asked this great question, and I'm like, "Well, I know that that's cleave, and that's like a special ability you get like way later."
Hmm.
And I'm like, yes, you can. And I need you to roll a athletics check and to see if you can kind of power through that swing, and then you'll do damage to the other guy equal to your strength modifier. I just made up a rule on the fly,
Yeah.
and the whole table is like watching his roll,
Yeah.
and he makes it. I made a really low DC because I want him to win. He makes the roll, and everyone cheers, and he gets to cut the other guy, and it was a lot of fun. And so it doesn't take a lot. This is small victories that can delight kids. It can delight players of
Hmm.
any age, really. And so that's the two that popped in my mind right away.
Yeah, I think that illustrates kind of the point I was looking for, actually, because and you played into my scheme here. I've only played with children twice. I ran a couple games for my niece and nephews, who are around 7 to 12 years old. And both times, my niece comes up with the most outrageous, creative way to solve a problem,
Oh
which
yeah,
put in my mind that I tend to think children a lot of times will be the ones that will look at your problem and solve it in a way that you won't think about
yeah,
beforehand, and then that will force you as a DM to think a little more creatively yourself and like, how would a player solve this problem? What can I do to, make it interesting for them? And so that's interesting that your stories were both about the creativity of the players and how
yeah.
they approached a problem and solved it accidentally or intentionally.
Yeah, exactly. Because I mean, when you're a kid, you don't know what you don't know, and so
Hmm.
I think that fosters creativity that kids are so well known for, and they've spent up to this point their entire lives imagining and problem solving and creating stories and playing, and so they haven't gotten into the entrenched grooves that we as adults
Yeah.
have, where we kind of solve the same kinds of problems the same kinds of ways over and over. And so
Yeah.
it's really can be so rewarding running games for children, for students, because they will surprise you and it keeps you on your toes and it keeps you, just kind of ready to pivot and do what the game requires. So it's a lot of
Yeah,
fun.
that's really interesting. Um, Another question, and then I have one of my questions for you, but this one was also from the viewers here. They asked, any advice on running a table with varying party size? They have a core group of 3, but it can go up to 8. Uh, I've had that happen so many times.
Yeah, we're just like not all the players can show up that day.
Yeah, where
Yeah.
sometimes you get 2 or 3 players who are pretty consistent, but then suddenly one day you'll have 8 or 9 players ready to go. Any advice on running games like that, keeping them
Yeah.
smooth?
Man, if I had the perfect answer for that, I can make $1 million, because
Right?
that's that's the problem for every table, like you said, but I think that since you know that going in, or at least you know that now, that you need to create a narrative framework that makes that deficit into a benefit. And so find some kind of structure that does that. Like I think like about old X-Men comics, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes the whole team isn't there, and sometimes it's just like Storm, Wolverine, Jubilee, and Cyclops going on the adventure instead of the whole team, because I don't know, Colossus has the flu or something.
Which
And
happens.
yeah, it does happen. Even Russians get flu,
Mm-hmm.
and giant metal Russians. And the thing is that it's almost like you're choosing to hinder yourself to help promote that creativity, and so see it as an advantage, and then just find a way to play into that. So maybe there is a way that the team is divided into certain ways, because you probably have the same 3 core players that keep showing up, and it's the other ones, the other 5, that sometimes are there, sometimes not. And so maybe you have a quest giver that gives you very specific things that need very specific, a particular set of skills, if you will, to accomplish it. And so during downtime, they can send them off on their own side quest. And so that it's not going to affect the main story, but it still gives the other people something to do that doesn't feel like a unrelated one shot or just fluff, or a
Mm-hmm.
day of just role playing. And they may like that. Or find out reasons why the other people who can't show up might get taken out of the story for a bit. Maybe they're the ones who get sent on a side mission while they continue the main story, and then they get pulled back in and they come back with new information and new items and things like that. And so just build into your story a mechanism that allows for that kind of thing. Like if you think about Lord of the Rings, like Gandalf's there for a while and then he like leaves,
Yeah.
and he's like, "See ya, suckers," and you're like, "Okay, so now what?" He was like the best member of our party.
Yeah.
What do we do? But he's got his own stuff to do that comes really, really important much later.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so it was kind of built into the narrative. And so find a structure to do that. Um, and Yeah, like maybe have just a deity come in who will just yank them out of reality and talk to them and say, "Hey, I need you to do this really simple, innocuous thing, but it's on the astral plane. Don't worry, I'll put you back when you're done." And you're like, "Why did we have to steal this one rock from these Gith Yankee? That makes no sense." He's like, "No, it'll make sense later." And then you can weave it into the part of the larger
Yeah.
story.
That gives you a nice
So
thread to pull on.
exactly.
Wow.
So
That's
that's what I
that's
would say.
actually an idea. I hadn't thought about that
Yeah.
myself. And so that I enjoy that advice thinking about it, because I do have games where it's like, oh, I got the core 3 people show up all the time, and then I have like 4 others who maybe they'll show up, maybe they won't. And I had gotten to a point myself where I was like, okay, if you're not here, then you're just not, because I didn't want to have to come up with the story over and over again of like why this person left. There's always we fall into the trope of like, oh, this so and so decided to go shopping today, and that's why they're not here with the party. But I really like that idea of adding it into the story, making it a thing. Oh, these people are gone because they had another job to do somewhere else, and it can still advance the story of the whole overall group instead of just hindering things or feeling like a hindrance. Uh, that's it. I like that. I like that. I'm gonna have to put more effort in and get off of that lazy horse that I was sitting on, because that's solid advice right there. I like that.
Good. I'm glad you liked it.
I like that. So my question, and this was, I warned you about this one, and
It's an important question to me because getting started as a dungeon master is kind of daunting sometimes, especially now. There's so much. It's in the limelight in a lot of things. Like we get Critical Role, and you get to see the Matt Mercers and the Satine Phoenix. You get to see the people who are in the spotlight for being a dungeon master, and it's really easy to look at it and be like, oh, that's scary and difficult and tough. So my question is, what is one thing that what a piece of advice would you give to new dungeon masters that maybe it was something you would have liked to know when you first started?
New advice for new dungeon masters.
Yeah.
I think it has to boil down to simply this: is that there are many tables, but this one is yours. There's going to be commonalities across the world, across languages and cultures, and even time periods of a D&D table, where the dungeon master and the players sit and rolling polyhedrons. But there's going to be those commonalities, but every table is different. And you can't, and I know this has been said many, many times, but you can't compare yourselves to those other tables. You have to figure out your voice, your style, and what's going to bring you and your players joy and satisfaction in this story. Because at the end of the day, if you guys are telling a story together, it's a collaborative storytelling story, right? Game.
Mm-hmm.
And so you guys are telling the story together, and no one else is telling your story. No one else is putting input into this story that you're telling together through the lens of D&D. And so to compare it to something else is almost pointless. You can learn things from them, from other tables and other DMs, but they don't get a voice in your game because they're not the ones telling that story. And so just like, you can grow up as a writer and love Hemingway and Dickens and Le Guin, but you're like, but they're not writing my story, I am. But I love how Hemingway does this emotionally, and I like how Ursula Le Guin can keep things moving but not skimp on details. And I'm going to take those tips from them and those inspirations from them, but it's still my story. And to compare it to their work is pointless because it's not their work, it's mine. And so just remember, your table is your table. There are many, but this one is yours.
Yeah, that's another good reference. That is a really good advice. Brian yesterday had the Bearded Nerd on. He mentioned a similar concept and the same idea of just embrace what is yours. It's your table. Don't worry about what else is out there. And I think that is a perfectly valid tip for new DMs when you are looking at the world and being like, oh, I have to do that. I have to do, the voices, and I have to hunch over and walk around and be silly and goofy, and I might not be comfortable with that. But then you think about it, it's your table. You can do what you want. Mm-hmm. As long as it works for your players and you're having a good time, you're winning the game.
Yeah, what's that old saying that good artists borrow, great artists steal?
Yeah.
So
that's also very true.
Yeah, just keep those people in mind, like Matt Mercer's and Coville and Satine and Perkins and Jerry Holkins and all those guys. Like, they aren't put in front of us as paragons, something to be emulated, to attain to, but rather they're put up as examples to learn from and to kind of see different styles and see their strengths highlighted, so you can go, oh, I can create a great game that's nothing that focuses on this, because Satine's great at this, but Matt's good at this, and Jerry's good at this, and so I can just kind of borrow those things because I'm good at this, but not that, and I see how you can run a table that's not voice heavy, but I can still make great narrative. So they're examples to learn from, not something to attain to.
Yeah, definitely. We have one more question, so we'll do one more question, and then we're gonna call that a show. But this one is a pretty good one, tying into our conversation earlier about checking in with players and getting that communications open. The question is, do you have a good way to check in with your players, and how often do you do it?
Yeah, so my semi-regular group here in town, We use GroupMe, which is a free app that lets you basically all kind of talk in one kind of text chain, which is easier than just doing a big group text because not everyone has the same kind of phone. And
Yeah.
if you're all iPhone and they're Android, then the stuff isn't going to come through right. And if you need to add a player later, what do you do? Or if someone leaves the group, then it's messed up. So I kind of do it that way. I know a lot of people use Discord to great advantage. I know Chris Solo from Fabled 42, he uses Discord, makes channels where we all can talk. But yeah, I check in, I don't know, about once a week or so and just kind of talk with them and, hey, what'd you think of that particular thing or that kind of thing. And some of them I see face to face as well. But I think you can't go too long without, ghosting them and then the communication's lost.
Yeah.
But if you try to do it too much, then it makes you look kind of needy, I guess. And so, let them say what they've got to say and respond and react to it and then kind of, move on. And so I think within a couple of days after each session is probably really good, unless you got some kind of clue that things weren't okay. Like they were uncharacteristically quiet or they seemed flustered or there was a some kind of conflict between players, not characters, but players. Then you're like, okay, well, I'm going to check in with them tomorrow. Or, maybe during a break, I'll check in with them when we go grab another, soda out of the fridge and grab some chips and salsa. But yeah, I think within a couple of days after the game, check in, keep lines. An easy way to get a hold of you and or the group is really beneficial. And just watch out for those warning signs and up the communication when you see signs of trouble.
Yeah, communication is everything. I have one group of players that they started a text chain on day one, which was over a year ago, and every day I get about 10 to 15 messages, and then on the day after game day, that goes up to about 40 to 60 because they're too excited, and then the day before game day, it bumps up again to about 40 to 60. It's crazy, but I found in that group, because of that open communication, it's so much easier to talk about things and make sure you're going on the right path. Jason, where can people find you? Give me the full rundown list of where you are online.
Okay, so you can find me. The best place is on Instagram at CriticalDice, all in word. Also on Twitter at Critical_Dice. I have a Facebook page. Just look for Critical Dice. I have a YouTube channel, the same name as well, Critical Dice, here on YouTube. And you can find my website at thecriticaldice.com, where I sell dice and tools and downloads, and even something that I've really enjoyed having, which is the Endless Bag of Dice, which is my dice subscription service, where I send out hundreds and hundreds of sets of dice every single month to people all over the world.
Which that sounds crazy, but once you like dice, it's not that crazy.
No,
it's like,
people who like it
I need
really
a new dice
like
this month. It's the same as like I need a new loaf of bread this week.
Well, I hope you're not eating your dice, Richard, but
it depends on how long this quarantine lasts. You never know.
Yeah, that's true. Little known fact: you can eat dice. Don't eat dice, guys. Don't.
That's
do it.
an idea for your next dice. Just candy dice.
Believe me, I've looked into it.
I'm sure.
There are so many dangers with that.
Oh
my
okay.
gosh!
Dang it.
Yeah, it's just like I'm just like I really don't want to get sued. That's not good.
All right, Jason, thank you so much for coming on.
Of course.
Audience members, if you haven't seen his stuff, go check him out on Instagram. The website is currently linked in the description, but after this stream is over, I'll go update it with the other links so people can find everything. And that's where you can find all 400 and million of the story hooks, the plot hooks, and other things such as that. So thank you, Jason. And for the audience, tomorrow we'll be back. We have, I forgot his name, and I did not change it in my title, so you're going to have to wait. There we go. Oh, man, this is embarrassing.
Got DM.
It is got DM, yeah. And I have a little title card. Here we go. That I would put the name in, and then there we go. Now that's live. Yeah, Raymond aka Got DM, is going to be on tomorrow. So check back. We're probably going to talk about crafting, if I'm being honest,
He's
because
an
that's what
amazing
he
crafter.
does. So thanks for watching.